Hey everybody, and welcome back to the last video about this dataset, probably, unless I decide to make another one. In the playlist so far, we've talked about general marriage stats and how age, gender, and sexuality kind of shape the spouse that we pick in Stardew Valley. Today we're going to look at one final component of the survey, and that's the very last question actually. Do you feel that your identity is represented by the marriage candidates in Stardew Valley? The general stats are on the screen right now. Overall, we saw about 53% of responders say yes, about 40% or so said somewhat, and only 7% said that they did not feel represented at all. Now, that was a very broad question, and it could be interpreted in a few different ways. For today, I broke it down across 3 different subcategories. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is kind of our deeper dive or our different breakdown, and we'll start with gender here. And so what we're looking at is how many people or what percentage of people felt represented across a few different questions or different spectrums, I guess. It was all the same question. But our first graph here is just a reminder of the breakdown of what this demographic group looked like. So primarily women, almost 61% women, and then men at about 21.5%. 14% of our individuals identified as non-binary, and then we had about 2% and about 1.6% other and trans, respectively. So that's kind of the breakdown. What's nice, though, is that even though we have a huge chunk of our responders were women, we'll look at each individual group a little more closely. You'll see these 54.12% for our yes total percent, 39.62% for our somewhat total, and then 6.26% for our no total. And that should be the same across all of these. What we're going to be looking at is just how the numbers kind of break down. These are mostly just there so I could check my numbers. And the reason they don't exactly match with the numbers directly from the form is that if anybody left one or more of these questions blank, I pulled their results. So we ended up losing, I want to say, about 100 or so responders, just because they had left one or more of these questions blank, which they totally can, but I can't tell you about you if I don't have the info, you know? So looking at our yeses, we have about 63% of men felt represented and about 60% of women felt represented by the marriage candidates, and those are pretty high numbers. But then after that, it falls off down to about 32% for people that identified as a gender that wasn't really an option on the form. And then 24.86% of our non-binary folks felt represented, and then about 15% of the people that identified as trans, indicating that they felt represented on here. But if we go down to somewhat next, we actually see that while those 3 groups that were kind of at the bottom of the yes question, like they maybe don't feel completely represented, they do for the most part feel mostly represented. So I think that's a good step, at least. We have 75% of our trans responders, about 61% of our non-binary responders, and 56% of our other responders all feeling at least a little bit represented. And we got to start somewhere. And then our women and our men, this is just about everybody here. So adding up the yeses and the somewhats gets us pretty close to 100. So we're at 35.4% for women and about 33.5% for men. And then finally, if we look at people that just felt like they're not represented at all, and again, I didn't ask, did your gender feel represented? I asked, do you feel represented? So they might not even be thinking about gender, and that would be fine too. But our non-binary folks, about 14% said not represented. About 12% of our other folks said that they didn't. And then 10% of our trans individuals did not. And then women and men, pretty small number here. The bars look big, but that's because the the range is a little more spread out. So if we kept these on an even playing field, I guess they would look itty bitty, which is a good thing. Most people are feeling represented. So that's good for gender. Let's take a look at sexual orientation. Over here, again, just a quick reminder, we have about 2/3 of our responders were either heterosexual or bisexual. And then about 10 or 11% of homosexual, asexual, and pansexual individuals, respectively. And then finally, about 4.28% of our responders didn't fit into any of those categories. And we'll see kind of an interesting number with them coming up here. For those of you who did feel represented, we saw that the heterosexual individuals and the bisexual individuals, the ones that saw the most representation in the survey, also feel the most represented in the game. And then we see our homosexual answerers at about 50%, which I actually thought would maybe be a little bit higher than that. So I was surprised by this. Again, I didn't ask, is your sexual orientation reflected in the game? So maybe they weren't thinking about that. And then at 41.8%, our pan folks are here, and about 35-ish for asexual individuals. And then when we look at our people that are answering other for their sexual orientation, we're at just under 30% feel represented. However, when we come down to somewhat, we see kind of the same thing. We see about 57% of those people that don't feel completely represented feeling at least somewhat represented. And then pretty similar numbers for our pansexual individuals. And for asexual folks too, if you didn't feel completely represented, you probably felt at least somewhat represented. And again, we're getting there. So I thought, with the addition of things like Krobus and him being perfect for Arrow Ace players, that's a good step in the right direction. And then homosexual and bisexual folks feeling like they were somewhat represented as well at 45.6 and 38.8%. And then heterosexual individuals at about 27.27% here. So the smallest group that felt somewhat represented, the largest group that felt represented. On the other hand, our largest group that did not feel represented was the group of people for which I didn't have a sexual orientation that fit. And I think that makes sense. So that's something that I can work on in my surveys, and that's something that we can work on in games too. Beyond them, though, it looks like for the most part, everybody's falling in that about 4.5 to 7.5%. So pretty solid across the board there as far as not making people feel completely unrepresented, but obviously still some work for us to do out there in the big wide world. And finally, let's take a look at age. So looking at age, again, the vast majority of our responders here were in this 19 to 29-year-old bracket. We also saw quite a few people in the 13 to 18 and a whole bunch in our 30 to 39. And then once you hit about 40 years old, you're not taking my survey, apparently. So if you're watching this and you're 40 or older, keep an eye out for the next one so that you can show up a little more. Or blame YouTube. That's what I would do, because they're the ones that should have sent it to you. However, looking over here at who is feeling represented, again, these are some smaller groups, but we see our 50 to 59-year-olds are feeling pretty well represented by the marriage candidates. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then our 60 plus and 40 to 49 are about 40% or lower, feeling very represented. And then we see our 30 to 39-year-olds also feeling pretty well represented, which I would have guessed that this number for 30 through 39-year-olds would be a little bit lower than the 19 through 29-year-olds. When I look at the marriage candidates in Stardew Valley, a lot of them feel like they're more in this late teens to early 20s to maybe even mid 20s for some, with very few feeling like 30 or older for me. So again, maybe the people answering this weren't thinking like, do I feel represented as a 35-year-old? Maybe they were thinking, I feel represented as a 35-year-old bisexual woman, So there's a few different layers there, and I don't want to drill too deep, and I also don't have like Azure or Tableau, so I can't. I mean, I could. It'd just be a lot of like manual labor, and manual Excel labor. Anyway, looking at our percent people that felt somewhat represented, though, if you didn't feel completely represented at 60 plus, you did at least feel somewhat represented, because there are none of you that did not feel represented, and I think that's because there were only like 5 of you total, so these numbers are everybody. And then next up, same kind of thing here. If you didn't feel completely represented as a 40 through 49-year-old, you at least felt somewhat represented, and again, that's a good place to be. We also see our 13 through 18-year-olds coming in right under about half, and then in the 30s and down to about only 26% of our 50 through 59-year-old folks feeling somewhat represented, but that's also coming off the back of being the group with the largest feeling of being represented. And I've said represented so many times that it's kind of starting to lose its meaning to me, actually. And then finally, for our folks that did not feel represented at all, we have our 40 through 49-year-olds at about just under 15%. Then our 13 through 18-year-olds coming in at 8.13%, which I actually that does make sense to me. Like, the people that you're marrying, if you're looking at age, there are probably some that are pretty close to your age group at about 18. But if you're marrying people at, you know, as a player at 13 years old, you're not marrying people that match your age. So I think this makes sense and could possibly even be higher. But again, I wasn't asking them specifically about age, so they might not have even considered that. So overall, for the most part, looking across these, we can see that there aren't a ton of people that feel completely unrepresented. You know, in no case were we higher than 15% of any individual group here, and less than about 7% of all responders felt completely unrepresented by the marriage candidates in Stardew Valley. And I think that's awesome. That's a great place to be. I talked a little bit in the first survey about what people are looking for. We were looking for more marriage candidates that are people of color, a broader range of sexual orientations, and more gender representation. So some things to think about if you're making games. I am not. I just like looking at the numbers. If you have anything else you want to see from this data, you know, drop me a comment. Let me know what you're looking for. Otherwise, I think this might be it for this data set. So I hope you guys have had fun. I have. And I hope I'll see you in the next set of videos. Thanks, everybody. Bye.